Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Radwan and Asma and Nader and everyone for the invitation. I'm a political theorist, not a policy analyst or political scientist, and my interest is mostly in democratic theory, which is admittedly just one, perhaps the smallest facet of explaining democratic transition and democratic consolidation. I don't think anybody believes that the only or even the most important factor in explaining the success of democracy so far in Tunisia, the failure of it in Egypt, and the risk of it in Turkey has to do with political ideology or the interpretation of Islam and democracy. So nobody, I don't think that's the case. At the same time, I think it is very important. I think the idea of legitimacy for a political system or a constitution and the long-term sense that a political system and a constitutional order more or less harmonizes with your conception of morality, your conception of human rights, your conception of the purposes of what politics is supposed to do, is perhaps not a quantifiable, but also a not insignificant factor. And so I approach this I'm finishing a book on what I call the invention of popular sovereignty in modern Islamic thought. Sheikh Rashid al-Ghannouchi is a very important figure in this. He's an important figure in the book that I'm writing. And I also just completed in December and January a series of sort of 6 or 7 day dialogues with him that are hopefully going to be forthcoming as a book later this year in English and in Arabic. And so what I want to speak a little bit about today is a series of transitions. First, what was the theory of Islamic democracy that was formulated by Ghannouchi and others in the period before the revolution? So Ghannouchi has for a long time been acknowledged as a particularly democratic thinker within political Islam or within the broad Islamic movement. What does that mean, and what particular theory of democracy was being articulated? There is no single theory of democracy, even in Western secular democracy, so shouldn't be problematic at all to ask what were some of the particular contours of the harmonization between Islam and democratic commitments. But since the 2011 revolution, there's been an extremely complicated constitutive moment, a moment of creating a constitution, extremely complicated party politics, legislative politics, security politics, and it would be astonishingly surprising if Ghannouchi's own ideological views before the revolution told us anything at all about the behavior of Nahda or other political actors. But nonetheless, it's important to articulate what is the relationship between party ideology and the understanding of Islamic political theory and this new constitutional order. And accordingly, Ghannouchi has written a number of important essays and speeches and articles that address some of these questions, and I want to say a few things about that. And then to conclude, I want to sort of introduce what I think were some of the 6 or 7 most intriguing themes that came out of our dialogues, and then ask a few questions about what are some of the possibilities for thinking about the relationship between your moral or religious commitments to an ideal political order and the kinds of compromises that come out of constitution making. So just very, very quickly, when we look at some of the high sort of ideal theories that were elaborated, for example, in Ghannouchi's book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. What was democratic? Why do we call this a particularly democratic theory? But what were some of the specific Islamic elements of this that make it a distinctive theory of democracy? So the first, like with almost all Sunni political thought, the claim is that the people, and only the people, is the source of all political institutions. Al-Sha'ab or al-Ummah, masdar al-sulutat. But this is not just political offices, not just the head of state, not just areas in which the obligation to engage in shura is institutionalized, but also legislative and religious institutions. So any idea that there are religious experts or scholars that are evaluating legislation from a Sharia compatibility standpoint, in Ghannouchi's earliest theories, all of those offices derive their legitimacy only from popular ratification and appointment and not from their own epistemic authority. Second was a very, very radical commitment to the rule of law. Nobody is above the law, and there was also no law that necessarily predates the political system. So the political system creates the law that is being applied, and the entire political system is held rigorously to the standards of the rule of law. The third is that the constituent authority of the people is fairly widespread. So in classical Islamic theory, you might say, well, the people elects the caliph or the head of state or whatever it is, but the people is not free to create new institutions or to change the office of the caliphate or to radically create new constitutional offices. In not only Ghanouchi's, but especially in his, the authority of the people to use their power of shura and legislation on the basis of public interest was very, very widespread to figure out what the constitutional order ought to be. And fourth, the role of the people, not only in legislating on worldly, dunyawi areas, or areas that pertain to the merely public welfare or maslaha, but also determining what aspects of the Islamic Sharia are to be applied in political life, was to a large extent assigned to legislative and even public forms of institutions that the people participated in directly. So that's why we refer to this as a particularly democratic theory. At the same time, it must be noticed that this is not merely an articulation of liberal secular democratic theory. And so I want to point to four important aspects of Ghanouchi's pre-revolutionary political philosophy that I think are particularly not represented in the post-revolutionary order. The first is that this is a perfectionist theory of political life. The purpose of politics is not just to manage conflict, not just to get rid of terrorism, not just to deal with the IMF, not just to deal with agricultural policy, but to make humans better humans. The purpose of political life is to create the ideal conditions for as many people as possible to be the best possible Muslims they can be. And that's very, very clearly articulated in this political theory, including in the reprinting of Public Freedoms in the Islamic State that came in 2015. Second, unlike a lot of democratic theory, particularly Madisonian or Montesquieuian democratic theory, where the purpose of political institutions is to balance ambition, balance powers against powers, and to manage conflict, in Ghanouchi's democratic theory, the purpose of all institutions is to represent and harmonize a certain kind of moral unity. So there is a division of institutions. There's a judiciary, executive, legislative power, but they are not meant to be at odds with one another. They are meant to be united around certain kinds of moral purposes that are determined by Islam. And so he directly discusses Madison and Montesquieu and says why an Islamic democratic theory can never accept the radical pessimism that's embodied in those theories about the possibility for political and moral unity. In turn, when I refer to this as a kind of vision of a republic of virtue, in many ways it's deeply democratic, but it's a democracy that both relies upon and assumes, but also aspires to, self-governance of a people that is united around a conception of virtue. The idea is that it is a community and not just a society that is united around moral purposes, united more or less around religious commitment, and united around the idea that self-governance is about both applying your knowledge, but applying your will and your morality towards certain kinds of collective goals. So it's a different kind of virtue or a different kind of republic than one that sees politics as managing conflict and managing the inevitable competition between self-interest. And so finally, this is a vision of democracy in which the Sharia is supposed to remain sovereign, but it's a kind of deliberative Sharia. It's a Sharia that emerges out of institutions, public opinion, and the participation of the people in trying to figure out what the appropriate representation at a particular time and place is of this dialectic between text, tradition, and the contemporary moment. Now, needless to say, none of those latter values or aspirations appear to be represented in the 2014 Constitution, which isn't a criticism either of the 2014 Constitution nor Ghanouchi's or Ennahda's commitment to that Constitution. It's just a kind of a brute fact about political life and the cunning of politics. In fact, I think it's a little bit like what our last speaker was saying. In Tunisia, we don't have any other option. There's no sovereign military. There's no sovereign religious authority. There's no great power. There's no possibility for Tunisians to manage their political affairs except through political dialogue amongst themselves. And that's what makes it different from a lot of other countries. But since this period, without for one second questioning Ennahda's commitment to the constitutive process or to the 2014 Constitution, which obviously they played a large role in creating, Ghanouchi has written a lot of things, speeches and essays, discussing what is the approach to certain kinds of aspects of the Constitution and the new political order that are somewhat questionable from the standpoint of traditional Islamist ideology. Three questions, I think, are repeatedly brought up. One is the absence of any reference to the Sharia in the Constitution. Second is certain language that you see in the Constitution, like referring to human rights as universal, as opposed to merely recognized or appropriate. And third, the general understanding of what kind of political life is imagined by this new order. And I think in reading a lot of his various essays, four big themes are repeated over and over again. The first is this astonishing redefinition of what the Sharia is. So when he's asked, how do we deal with the fact that there's no reference to the Sharia? He says at one point, the Sharia only came down, was only revealed for no other purpose than limiting government and limiting rulers. Now, everyone knows that that's not true, and everyone knows that that wasn't even his view in his writings, but it's an astonishing statement that any form of government that limits government and limits the power, the arbitrary power of rulers, fulfills the purpose of the Sharia. Second, I think most of his thinking before the revolution, and most of Islamist thinking since Maududi, the arch metaphor for Islamic political thought is this metaphor of the entire people as God's caliph, right? All Muslims have received God's authority on loan, and then they delegate it to rulers. And according to this, the metaphor of the founding moment of political life in Medina serves the purpose of establishing that Islam must be political. Why is Islam deen wa dawla? Because that's how Islam began in Medina, unlike Christianity, unlike other religious experiences. The Medina Covenant, or the Sahifat al-Medina, is now for Ghanouchi in the post-revolutionary period the kind of arch metaphor for political life, but it's put to a completely different purpose. For Ghanouchi now, what the example of Medina establishes is the commitment to a radical kind of pluralism. So the Covenant of Medina was not only between Muslims, not only between Muslims and Jews, but also between Muslims, Jews, and pagans. And what he uses this to establish, it says at one point, we Muslims are fortunate that our political life began in a moment of radical pluralism. And so what he does is to say there is nothing more natural or Islamic or legitimate than for us to organize political life around a very, very broad kind of pluralism that doesn't just include mutual recognition between Islamic schools or mutual recognition between Muslims and the people of the book, but really without regard for any kind of metaphysical or moral harmony whatsoever, except for moral harmony around the purposes of political life. And then finally, there's this idea that the most important thing in politics, particularly constitutional politics, is consensus per se, agreement in the conditions of the existing pluralism, not agreement between reasonable pluralism or agreement between those that are committed to some particular conception of virtue, but whatever the state of pluralism and disagreement is now, politics must seek agreement given that reality. So on questions like the universality of human rights, the absence of Sharia in the Constitution, the whole controversy around what does takamul between, the complementarity between the genders mean exactly. Time after time, he says, if this was a matter of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and disagreement, he refers to the Sharia itself as a mawdu'a ikhtilafi, a subject of disagreement, and that alone is reason enough to defer it to some other time. So consensus with actually existing pluralism is the kind of arch value governing politics. What the Islamic sort of doctrinal underpinning of that is not always clear. During these dialogues that we conducted, we covered a wide range of things, from his earliest childhood to his political formation, his intellectual journey, the history of the Islamic movement, and so forth. But my own interest was largely in the philosophical and theological issues. And I want to just bring out 6 major themes that I thought were most interesting and I thought would be most appropriate for today. The first is that there is an attempt on his part to argue for a kind of continuity from his previous views to the present. What we agreed to today is kind of what I was always arguing for. Nobody, I think, really is persuaded by that entirely. Second, and most interestingly, is a kind of skepticism about the state per se. And this is very fascinating because, as we all know, this capturing the state or using the state as a means to bring about an Islamic society was the political goal of political Islam for most of the 20th century. And there's this turn to seeing the state as less of a vehicle for the realization of the good life. The state is primarily seen as an agent of harm, and thus its own harms should be reduced. 3, society as seen as a space of radical pluralism of ways of life. So in addition to Medina, another metaphor that came up was 9th and 10th century Baghdad. And he said, look what you had in Baghdad. You had atheists, materialists, philosophers, Zoroastrians, all of these things. And was this any harm to us? Did Islam collapse because the state didn't interfere with this sort of thing? So there's an increasing view that the state should be a sphere that just provides a space for the plurality of different kinds of ways of life. And so what I think his thought is kind of moving to is what the Harvard political philosopher Judith Shklar referred to as a kind of liberalism or democracy of fear, which is that without trying to say what's so great about individual liberty or autonomy or what's so great about this or that, it focuses on the idea that politics is full of all kinds of dangers, almost limitless dangers: torture, repression, jailing, massacre. And the primary focus of politics should first be on minimizing the harm that state and power and politics can do. 2 more points. 5, then, what happens to the Sharia? And I think there's a fascinating sense in which you sort of get something like Plato's Euthyphro question, which is that on a previous version of Islamic legal theory, you might say that there is a vision of the law, and legal theory, the scholars arguing about the law, is the mechanism that is most likely to result in the most accurate interpretation of God's will. So God's will exists, and we have a kind of best chances of figuring it out through legal theory. I think he's coming also very close now to saying something like this: if we in a public sphere have institutions that are free and uncoerced, whatever comes out of these sorts of things in a free and uncoerced way through public opinion and deliberation is as close as it gets to identifying something as being legitimate according to the Sharia. And then finally, a small skeptical note, which is to say, the commitment to social and political pluralism can't be questioned. At the same time, there still is this view that at the intellectual and rational level, all sane and well-functioning minds would result in acknowledging the existence of God and the truth of Islam. So we had this discussion about Kant's antinomies of reason. He flat out said, this is wrong. Reason can prove the existence of God and the veracity of Islam, and this is not internal to reason. So there is this sense that
that the radical moral pluralism that exists has to be accepted, has to be lived with, but might not necessarily be a condition that shouldn't be sort of engaged with and perhaps transformed over a long period of time through persuasion and education and those sorts of things. Thank you.